Hi, this is Roger in Finland, and today we're going to take a detailed look at Sony a6400's S&Q modes. And for the impatient ones, to turn it on, you put the dial on top to S&Q mode. Then if you need to change the settings, you go to the movie, like the camera number 2, movie 1, the first page, S&Q settings, and then you can change something called record setting, which is to what it conforms to, and then the frame rate, and you're good to go. And this allows you to shoot, if you're in PAL, in 1, 2, 3, 6, 12, 25, 50 or 100 frames per second, conform to 25 or 50 frames per second. And if you're in NTSC mode, then you can shoot in 1, 2, 4, 8, 15, 30, 60 and 120 frames per second, conform to 60, 30 or 24 frames per second. All of this without audio, with autofocus, and with some quirks that we're going to go through soon. Most of the things that I'm going to be talking is in PAL, but basically everything that applies to 100 frames per second in PAL will apply in the same way and same limitations in 120 frames per second in NTSC.
Papa,
Digas.
että saanko mä pelaa Super Mario Party?
Si em deixes acabar això, acabo això de seguida i llavors vinc allà amb tu.
Okay.
Alright, and now for some more details, and today there will be quite a few of them. First of all, what does it mean, the conforming to something? Well, if you're shooting at 100 frames per second conformed into 25, that clip will effectively behave in your editing software as a 25 frames per second clip, which is slowed down. That's different if you're shooting a clip in the normal movie mode at 100 frames per second, because that is intended to do 100 frames per second and then play it back at 100 frames per second. If you want to slow that down, then you're gonna have to do it manually somehow. And at least in DaVinci Resolve, you can do it two ways. One is changing the clip attributes from 100 to 25, or change the clip speed and put in the 25%. Both methods will result into a slow motion 4 times, which will look in slow motion terms in the same way than the S&Q 100 frames per second. So that's about conforming. So now let's take a look at the quirks, and the very first one is that this in the a6400 works only, meaning the S&Q mode, in full HD. The codec is XAVC SHD, but you cannot have any of these S&Q modes in 4K. The second quirk is that there's no audio. To me it doesn't matter, because anytime that I use slow motion, I don't use the audio at all, but for some people that might be a deal breaker. Third quirk, autofocus. You actually do get continuous autofocus with all the modes, and you get face detection in all the different frame rates except 100 frames per second. Then you still do get autofocus, but without the face detection. Fourth, the crop. There's no crop at all, or there's just the normal APS-C crop of 1.5 in the Sony case, except, once again, 100 frames per second, which it crops slightly more. And the fifth one, it might be a little bit more interesting. It's about the bit rates or data rates, and I'm going to be talking about the PAL case. If you want to know more details about the NTSC, I have a table as well. I'm going to put a link in the description below so you can check that table. I'm going to be showing and talking here about the PAL one, but please go and check the NTSC if that's your use case. The first thing about the bit rates is that in general, more is better, or what it happens really is that more bit rate, it means that there's more information, which usually translates to better quality, and definitely it translates to having more room for post-production work. And now for the details, I'm going to have to look at my notes, but frame rates from 1 to 25, you have 50 megabits per second in both conforming to 50 and 25 frames per second. At 50 frames per second, you get 25 megabits per second when conforming to 25, and 50 megabits per second when conforming to 50, which is normal speed anyway. And now again for the exception, which is 100 frames per second. it only conforms to 25p, or in the case of NTSC, 120 frames per second do conform to 30 and 24, but not to 60. And the bitrate for 100 frames per second conform to 25 frames per second. That's 16 megabits per second, which sounds pretty small, but I think there's an explanation for that. If we compare 100 frames per second in the S&Q mode compared to the normal movie mode with 100 frames per second in Full HD, in there we get, in the movie mode, 100 megabits per second or 60 megabits per second, we can choose. We do get audio, and we do get the same limitations of slight crop and no face detection. So a good question now is, how come you get 100 or 60 megabits per second in movie mode and only 16 megabits in S&Q? My guess, and I would have to check that very much, so don't quote me on it, is because this bit rate is about the delivery rate. So when we have in the normal movie mode 100 frames per second and 60 megabits per second, that's if we would play that footage at 100 frames per second. If we slow that down, it means that we're showing only a fourth of those frames. That means that in the delivery, because we have slowed it down, for each second we add also a fourth of the bit rate. And in the case of 60, we would get about 15, which is pretty much the same as the 16 megabits per second bit rate of S&Q 100 frames per second. So with all that said, I see no reason to use S&Q for slow motion, since I believe that the movie mode will give you the same amount of frames per second, more data, so more better bit rate, especially if you choose the 100 megabits per second, and audio with the same crop and the same limitation with autofocus. So the only difference is that you would have to slow it down in post instead of already being a 25 frames per second clip, which is really small work compared to the advantages. So what are the use cases for this? As said, I see no benefit in slow motion, but up to you. If maybe you want the actually smaller bit rate, or you really don't care about the audio, or you really hate doing anything in post. And maybe the funky speeding up, so the Q part of it, basically the frame rates which are slower than the conformed to, meaning 1 frame per second conformed to 25, 6, etc. So what you have is a kind of funky time-lapse sped up thing. So if that's something that you want to use, well, there you go. Now you know how to use it in S&Q and what the different modes do. And before closing, let me show you a summary. I'm going to show the PAL version first. So I have here the frames per second, then whether you conform to 50 or 25p, then what is the bit rate and the kind of slowdown or speed up factor for each of the two, whether the autofocus works, and whether there's a crop or not. And that's the table. And now I'm going to show the same table for NTSC. And it's pretty much the same thing, but instead of having 50 and 25, this one has 60, 30, and 24p. Since those are the options what you can conform to in NTSC using the S&Q mode. I have a PDF of each of these two tables linked down below, so if you want to download that, please just go ahead. Alright, but maybe let's close with a quick summary. If you want to use the S&Q mode, which gives you automatically slow motion or time-lapse quick motion, remember, dial on top, and to set it, you go to the menu, Movie 1, S&Q settings to set whatever you want, and there you go, you get autofocus, you get no audio, but it's easy to drag the clips as they are to your timeline. I personally haven't used it before I was asked to explain how it works, so I had to investigate a little bit, and as said, I prefer to use the normal movie mode in 100 frames per second if I need to do anything with slow motion. But I hope the video clarified things for you guys, that you learned something new today, and if you liked it, please click like and subscribe, and we're gonna see you soon for some more content.